Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between. You are in for a treat today. It is this interview with Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry is so thought-provoking and so intellectual. I felt like I was in a graduate school philosophy class. If you have not heard Raymond Moody before, I had him on the show years ago. He was one of my very early famous, I put that in quotes, guests in the field, because he is very famous in the field of near-death experiences. He coined the term life after life. He's the leading authority on near-death experiencers and the founder of Life After Life Institute. And he always brings so much intellectualism to everything he talks about. Oftentimes it's sometimes beyond what I can even comprehend and understand, because he comes from a philosophy background, which makes how he thinks about his understanding of the afterlife and what happens when we die even more fascinating. And in combination today with Paul Perry, who has co-written many of the books with him, including The Light Beyond and Evidence of the Afterlife. And today they are on the show talking about their new book, Proof of Life After Life. So the question is, are we now at a point in our evolution of consciousness that we have proven that there is life after life? With that, I bring you today's episode with Dr. Raymond Moody and Paul Perry.
We need at our table of awareness the logician, but equally we need the intuitive, we need the mystic.
I almost died. I was allowed to go to the very precipice of death, of life and death, and look over the edge. And I was allowed to behold what was there and allowed to come back. Most people aren't.
When we talk about being aligned with ourself or being aligned with our soul or hearing our higher self, that's really what we're talking about, is being connected to that divine part of ourself, that light-filled part of us that is connected to God energy, that is connected to everybody here and every experience we've ever had.
If more doctors, more professionals can open up to use intuitive gifts in their work, that's really important.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and medium, and here we explore life, death, mediumship, near-death experiences, consciousness, and what it all means. Welcome, Paul and Raymond, to Life, Death, and the Space Between.
Thank you.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Amy.
This is dream come true again for me, because Raymond, I was saying earlier to Paul, who I've never met before, that you were someone that came on really early in my podcasting career when I was just a little peon. I didn't have any following. I didn't have any, I barely had any podcasts that I had put out. And you came on then to talk with me about all of your work, which, back then I was just sort of diving into. And now I'm so excited to have you back with Paul, who wrote this incredible new book, Proof of Life After Life. So your first book of many books, Life After Life, was the research into near-death experiences. But now, what is different about this? Because you've written books alone, you've written books together. What makes this book different, that we are now at this point where we are saying we have proof of life after life?
You want me to go first?
I think there's several things. One is the personal relationship with Paul is just like a relative now. And also because I am very abstruse. I was a professor of symbolic logic, all right, and ancient Greek philosophy. And I just think in a very precise kind of philosophical way. But this question of near-death experiences and afterlife is something important to everybody. And so I can't, with the kinds of things I think of, I can't reach the big audience, right? But Paul, with his background in fine arts, he got a MFA, Master of Fine Arts, and then journalism. And so Paul has to be able to put things into some format where people who are not philosophy professors can understand it. So and also because this is kind of getting undeniable now. It's when I started out with this, it was actually after I'd already kind of picked up on this, and Plato, and by knowing George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at UVA when I was an undergraduate philosophy student, and I heard him talk about his experience. And at that time, I gathered they just weren't as common. But then by the time I got my PhD in philosophy in about 1969 to 72, I was a professor of philosophy at East Carolina. And I taught Plato's work, the Phaedo mainly. And I just found it was pretty soon. Students would come up, when I almost died. And then I began to talk about it, and I did a faculty presentation on it. There were several faculty members there. A couple of them are in my book. I just realized that this was something that had suddenly exploded, which I attributed to the development of CPR because, I started talking to these civic clubs in this little town. At that time, it was an all-male province, right? These were the Rotarians and the Lions Club, and they were the movers and shakers in towns in this town. And everyone I went to, there was somebody there. Yeah, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody this, and almost all of them at first were the people who had been resuscitated with this, CPR. So I kind of figured it was something that had always been there. I mean, the Greeks talked about it extensively, but that what had happened was the development of this CPR technology created a situation, a situation in which something that had always been, but had been extraordinarily rare, because few people who came close to death would survive. But suddenly that factor was removed, and it was just everywhere. And it's getting more in that way now, because there's just, lots of people are having this experience. Plus, this is generational, and Paul and I have seen this probably several cycles now, but this is an episodic phenomenon. So it's like once in a while, every 10 years or so, there's a peak in interest in these near-death experiences. And I think it's probably because of generational, right? Like a whole new generation of people grows up who've never heard of this. Yeah. And so, and I feel like there's one building now. So the purpose of this book really is to sort of bring those two things together. A very abstract thing, which is really needed for a rational understanding of these near-death experiences, is to go beyond the way we think now. But, few people are going to be interested in going beyond the way we think now, right? And, that's just the reality. So I think
but you cover,
for some, to be the synthesis of the abstract and what people can understand.
But you cover in this book so much more than just near-death experiences, right? And so is that what feels like, what do you feel like, Paul, constitutes proof at this point? Because there's been, decades of research that have shown the same thing over and over again. So what's different now?
Well, it's a different way of looking at it. I mean, for instance, Raymond and I'll use us as examples. We worked on this stuff for how many years? 40 years?
Well, since 1988, however, it was 30.
August of 1988, right?
Since
37
that time is however long that is, 37 years.
Yeah. And, we were always dealing with near-death experiences, but there's things that are off on the side road from a standard near-death experience. One of those is a shared death experience. Shared death experience is where someone who's well and maybe a bystander at someone's death experiences their near-death experience in one way or another. And then there's different types as well. And we had always had that. We've had shared death experiences in our books from the first book. And we didn't pay enough attention to it at the time. And then, 13 years ago or so, Raymond had a shared death experience with the death of his mother. And I also had a shared death experience with the death of my mother. And they were very different. Raymond's was in a room. He should tell this story. It's interesting.
Yeah, I'd love to hear both of the experiences.
Well, Raymond, tell yours, and then I'll tell mine. Okay.
Well, actually, my entree to this was with a woman named Martha McCraney, who was one of my psychiatry professors.
Right.
And just a wonderful lady. And, at that time, they had what they called a Facebook then, they had photographs of all the medical students, right? So the faculty could get to know everybody. So I was in the bookstore at the Medical College of Georgia. And I could date it exactly because there was a Playboy magazine, and I never had any, I swear. I mean, that is just so adolescent and childish to me. I just never any interest. But I saw the Playboy there on the newsstand, and there was an article in it about somebody you don't know, Amy, but you really should know. In about 1948 or 1949, the professional wrestling got very big on TV because the promoters, like in Chicago at the Cow Palace or wherever it was, and the promoters learned that if they did the TV show, that would bring people out to the auditorium. And to the TV channel, it was a way to fill time, right? So the professional wrestling was very big then. Now this was 1948, and the wrestling was big on TV. And into that situation stepped a guy named George Wagner, who had a really great sense of humor, and he let his hair grow out long and dyed it bleached blonde. And he got his wife to make him these beautiful robes. And he hired a guy to be his valet who would dress up in a tuxedo with a silver tray. And the valet would put rose petals on the silver tray and a big bug sprayer. So Gorgeous George he was, and he would come out and people hated him, and he just, and the valet would throw rose petals in his path, and he would go into the ring, and, it was all narcissism. I mean, the greatest. And he was just the greatest delight. And I forgot where I was going with that, actually. But you should
shared death. We were talking shared death experiences.
Yeah. So anyway, I was reading this article about Gorgeous George and the Playboy, and I heard this sweet voice from my right, Dr. Moody. She recognized me, and I hope she didn't pay attention to the Playboy, but what she said was she identified herself as Martha McCraney, and she was a psychiatry professor, and she knew about my work. And she said, I wanted to tell you about some mentation I had when I was resuscitating my mother. And she had like a shared death experience. I mean, she wasn't ill or injured, but while she was resuscitating her mother, as her mother died, she herself floated out of her body, saw the scene from above, saw this tunnel open up with relatives of her mother's emerging from it. And that was the first one I knew of. That was December probably of 1972. I think that was the month that issue came out. And so that was the first one I heard, but I didn't really hear any others in medical school that I could remember. And so since I only had that one case, I didn't put it in Life After Life because I didn't know what to make of it if there was only one. And but then,
And
over
also
the
what
years,
it was called, right? I would imagine you didn't
yeah,
know specifically how to label that
yeah,
because she
yeah,
didn't die. Her mom died.
that's right.
But that
But
was
it
your
was the
first
same
shared
experience.
death experience, right?
Yeah,
That was,
and so
Mm-hmm.
just gradually, I realized more and more that you don't have to be almost dead to have one of these experiences. It's very common as well among bystanders at the death of somebody else who are not themselves ill or injured, but who, as the dying person passes away, the bystanders have elements of these same experiences, including Martha did not have this particular one, but I've had quite a number of cases of people who empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who
Mm.
passes away. And to me, that's the most shocking thing I've learned about this because, I'm trying to get myself recused from my own life review, much less have a spectator there. But
For those who don't know, most of my listeners, if they've been listening, can you just define what a life review is for them?
yeah, it's very commonly people who come close to death but who come back or are revived tell us that at some point in this experience, time stands still and there's no more time, and they feel that they are surrounded by a holographic panorama, which consists of everything they've ever done. And I've seen a little shift in this just in the time I've been talking about this, because when I was back in the 69, 74, somewhere in that range, I began to realize that this has a lot to do with what psychologists call loss of ego boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people say that all of a sudden you're surrounded. There's no more time, and you're surrounded by this hologram of everything you've ever done. And I'm using that word hologram advisedly because when I first started this back in the 60s and 70s, what the people would say, they would compare it to like a slide projector. They
Right.
used it
Well,
to.
we have to put words to things, even though
That's
they
right.
probably
Right.
are
And
ineffable in
now
that
it's
way, but
more
it's
like
how we
they
can.
talk about holograms and panoramas and so on. But it's people say that in this point of view, you see everything you've ever done. And George Ritchie, to emphasize this, said at one time, I saw everything I had done, including my own birth, my cesarean section, he said. And but when you see this, you are not just in the consciousness you had when you were doing each action of your life, but rather you also are empathically identified with the consciousness of the person with whom you've interacted, and so you see the effect of what your action had. If you do something unkind to somebody, you feel the sadness you brought, or if you see yourself doing a loving action, you feel the good feelings. But all the way through this, people say that very commonly they say they are accompanied in this by a being of light. Some people say God, some people say Christ, some people say an angel. But whatever the same description of a being who kind of knows everything about you but still loves you completely. And this is a very, people say that in this review, whatever you had been chasing, like I've been chasing knowledge all my life, never been able to understand the people who chase fame or power or money either. I mean, I would love to have a Uncle Scrooge money bin full of money, but I'm not the kind of person who go out and get it, because I'm doing my studying. And but whatever they were chasing before, people say that what this is all about is learning to love. I talked to Eben Alexander a few years ago, and I was saying, in the mental status exam, as you know, Amy, it's like the orienting axis. You want to know what you ask the patient: what day is this? What year is this? And you say, where are we? Which is time and space are the basic mental status orientation. And so knowing that people say there's no time and space in this other place they're in, I said, to Eben, what are the orienting axes there? And without a beat, he said, love and knowledge. And that's pretty much what I hear people say, that very often they say when there's a scene in which they've been learning something, there aren't any words, but people say that the thoughts come, and this being kind of focuses in on this one or these things where you've been learning, and the thought comes that even after you come over here, that something like this interesting, even after you come over here permanently, that will go on. And George Ritchie said that, he said, this process of learning, I gather, goes on quite literally for eternity. And some people with these very profound near-death experiences talk about seeing an institute of knowledge, or like an entire realm of existence that seems to,
which is what people would call the Akashic records, I guess. Is that?
Well, I don't know that term. I've heard it, but it's what people tell me is just and it's like George said, for example, that, and that George was very brilliant. He graduated from college at age 20. He was a real genius. But he said he couldn't understand what it's like. He could see into this place, but he couldn't understand what these beings, as he said, were up to. And he said that he was with Christ, was his way, and he said he saw into this place. He could see but they couldn't see him or Christ. And he was interested in that. He said he could see them, and he said he was very proud of them. He emphasized that, but they were unable to see him. It was kind of a one-way thing. And
what was your shared? Oh, sorry.
He said, just to illustrate, he said there was one aspect of this realm that you could compare to a library. And he said in one area of the library, he saw it was dedicated to the holy books of the universe. And I mean, I've not heard that just from George. This is what people who have these extremely lengthy cardiac arrests say.
And these people also feel as though they've been downloaded, if you will, with all the knowledge of the world. And a frustration for them is that when they come back, they know everything, but they can't remember it.
That's right.
Oftentimes can't remember it. So they have this frustrating but good thirst for knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's one of the changes that happens is they're with the near-death experience. They become type A without the anger, really.
I want to go back to the shared death experience, though.
So go ahead,
I was
going to say, deal with the one you had with your mother.
Yeah, as this is so funny because I had actually been, this is one of those weird things, but I had been out in Las Vegas, and this was 1994, May of 1994, and we were setting up a research program to study shared death experiences. I swear to God this happened. It's just so weird, but I swear to God it happened. So anyway, this was on a Sunday in May of 94, and we had this weekend conference, and the object was to try to understand these shared death experiences, some way of studying them. And I swear it was Sunday was the program was over, and I went to the shopping mall, and this was before cell phones, and I got out something you don't know about probably, Amy, a phone booth. You might not remember that.
I know about a phone booth.
Okay, cool. You remember those?
Love a good payphone booth.
And I called my mom and said, Happy Mother's Day. How are you doing? And she said, I remember her tone was very chipper. Oh, I'm doing great, she said. And then she said, and yesterday I developed this rash, and my brothers and sisters had taken her to the ER. And a doctor examined her, and he said he didn't think there was anything to it, but just as a precaution, he gave her an appointment to another doctor on Monday, which was the day after I talked to her. So that was the situation on Sunday. But when she went to the doctor on Monday, he said, you have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and you have 2 days to 2 weeks to live. And so I went back to Macon, Georgia, and we were there, my wife and I, with my mother, and during her 2 weeks, and before she died. And so as she was dying, people say these things, you can't really put it into words, but my way of saying it is that I felt like I was in when you invert 2 funnels and you put them together at the spout to kind of make this hourglass looking thing.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like that was the space I was in, and it was not composed of space, but of energy, which was turning this way. I mean, just like it had this wrenching move or whirling movement or something.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard my mother, not with my ears. It was definitely my mother talking, but it wasn't coming through the auditory channel. And she said, "I love you twice." And my brother-in-law felt the presence of, and my sister felt the presence of my dad, who had died 18 months before. But, the thing about that to me was that it kind of diffused my curiosity. I was very fascinated with these experiences, but then I had to take time away from it to process what happened to me. Mm-hmm. And then at some point, I don't know when it was, but Paul and I forgot when, began to work on shared death experiences after I sort of had processed this a little bit.
Yeah.
Paul, what was yours?
Well, it involved my mother too. There's many different types of shared death experiences. And this one, the one I had is slightly different from Raymond's. I had worked several years before my mother's death with a doctor at Washington University of Washington in Seattle. He was the head of neuropharmacology. And we were working on a project trying to turn his research on deja vu into a book. Well, we worked for a while on it, a couple of years, couldn't find anyone who was interested in it. So I hadn't spoken to him for easily 5 years at all. For no reason, we weren't angry with each other. We just didn't communicate. And then my mother got ill. She had kind of a rapid onset Alzheimer's. And on the day that she died, I got a phone call. It was a Sunday morning. I got a phone call from Vernon, this doctor in Washington. And he said, Paul, I was reading the paper this morning and a female voice said, "Call Paul Perry." So I ignored it. And I continued to read the paper, and about an hour or so later, this voice came on and said, "Call Paul Perry." So I'm calling you, and I don't know why. And I told him the story that my mother had rapid onset Alzheimer's, and he was the head of neuropharmacology, and he knew, a lot of things about Alzheimer's. And he started telling me some of the things they had attempted with people who had Alzheimer's, to see if they could somehow make them better. They knew they couldn't cure them, but they knew they could make them better. And he advised a number of things, including electroshock therapy, which they had recently tried with some people, and said it was very effective. Wow. And in the middle of this conversation, right toward the end, the phone started ringing. This was the day before iPhones. So I had that beep that would come up that a call was coming in. And I said, "Vern, I'll call you later. I have to answer this." I picked it up, and they told me that my mother had just died. And so what essentially was going on here is that somehow she was communicating with Vernon to get help from Vernon, but she never knew him. And that goes into the classification of a shared death experience. There's other classifications. So sometimes there's one called a precognitive experience, where you see these all the time, where someone has a sense that a relative of theirs or someone that they know, doesn't even have to be a close relative, in a distant place is dying.
Mm-hmm.
And they will see the person at the foot of their bed, which is a frequent one. They'll appear to them at night, generally when they're waking from a dream state, and they'll have a conversation with this person who says, I'm dying now." They talk about their death and their illness, or they are close to dying. And oftentimes this happens multiple times with one person. So there was some great research done in the 19th century about experiences like this. This is a precognitive experience. But it's a form of a psychic experience. And they recounted a number of people who had the sense that their cousins or relatives or friends were dying somewhere else, and they would write letters to their other friends who had also had the same experience. So you could end up having 2 or 3 people being contacted by this person at the hour of their death. And what they had in these days were letters, and to do research from. And they had these great letters about people saying that they had a sense that George was dying in China, and then they found out that he was a few days later. So these researchers were a bunch of research nerds like we are, and they would put all the evidence together and realize that this was a precognitive experience. So that's it.
But do we have any? Oh, sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. But that happens to this
Is there-
day, is what I'm getting.
Yeah. Is there any understanding of why it happens to some people and not other people in the same way? Like, why do some people who have near-death experiences, is there any similarities that we know of, or it's completely spontaneous? It's been a while since I've talked to you about what I'm up to. I want to first start by thanking so many of my supporters who have supported me on Patreon and in my Circle community. What's so exciting now is we have my new Circle community up and running, where if you want to contribute to supporting the podcast, you can do so at different levels for different values. So head on over to my Circle group. You can actually find the link in the show notes below. And there's opportunities to continue to support the podcast. And I have to say, your support of the podcast is frankly what has kept this podcast going over time. I have been funding the podcast solely by myself. I get a little bit of money in advertising dollars, but not a lot. So anything that you can give, if you have found value in this podcast, and it's not just giving without anything back, I will give back to you. You will be a part of this community with opportunities for discounts and conversations and ask Amy anythings. But it's a great opportunity for you to support what hopefully has helped you over the many, many years. Also, there's so many other ways now that you can work with me. I am offering a group course called Live Your Life Backwards, which is finishing its first cohort this winter and has been absolutely incredible. There's retreats coming up. There's workshops. There's one-on-one sessions with me. So many options that we can work together. So make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed to my podcast, and make sure you're subscribed to my newsletter, where you will get a free soul wisdom workbook to help you dig deeper into the virtues that you want to be living in this lifetime. We all need so much more spirituality now. We are in a spiritual crisis, and I am giving you so many tools to tap into your own spirituality. So check out, and don't forget to subscribe to Life, Death, and the Space Between so you never miss an episode.
It's not what you might think, is all I know. It's like I've been able, to me, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with whether people are religious. So, non-religious and religious people have them and don't have them, right? And it's like, and it's, Bruce Grayson had an interesting suggestion. He said that he thought that the people who did not have near-death experiences, as compared to those who did, he thought that it probably was or might be that the people who would have an experience would reach a point of giving up, and just giving up. and that like relaxing into it would bring it on.
Oh, so not resisting, but that's for near-death experiences. But
Yeah.
what about like shared death
Oh,
experiences or
Possibly be the same
pre?
thing.
yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, they kind of relax
No
into
idea.
it. Uh,
Mm.
yeah, it's a strange thing.
Yeah.
You would think in the age of AI and IT and everything else that we would get some kind of a clue as to what it is, but there really doesn't seem to be any of that. There are people researching it using AI
Mm-hmm.
tools and the like, but so far there's no real conclusion as to why these things happen.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah,
there's
and
other-
also it's quite often people think you would not necessarily suspect, right? It's like in North Carolina, I went to a hospice and there was a priest there and a nurse. And the nurse was like one of those very experienced earthy nurses, right?
Right.
So I forgot how I found out about them. I think through my sister Carol. And so I went there to interview them about shared death experience they had witnessed. So I was in this little room, like one of those nice little meeting rooms with the comfortable sofa and all. And I was talking to these two people about, I understood that they had some, contact with people with shared death experiences. And right to the left of me, at an angle of the little table, was sitting this beautiful picture. I mean, it was just this gorgeous entranceway. I mean, just a gorgeous picture. So, but I was talking to them, and they said that one day they heard these, I think, just like great coming from one of the rooms. And what it was, a woman was dying, and as she was dying, the room just filled with light, and her it was the relatives of this person who was dying that were making the and so they went in there, and so they talked to the family about it, and one of the people in the room had a camera. I swear this is true. And so the one of the relatives in the room took the picture just because this was so amazing, and that's what they had there on this table, was this picture of the most beautiful entranceway I've ever seen. I mean, just indescribable. And they said that was what came out of that. They said I remember them saying that the family thought at first the light got so bright that at first they thought it was a truck passing by outside reflecting the light in the room. But they quickly realized because it was getting brighter, and that, so, it's odd things happen.
There's 3 types of shared death experiences that we cover. I mean, there's like 7 or 8 different types of shared death experiences, but 3 that are interesting, very interesting, are the ones where they emanate light. There's music comes into the room, and that can stay sometimes for hours, or mist. And the mist, we've heard from several doctors. Doctors are opening up about this a lot more than they used to be, by the way.
Which is amazing because it gives so much validity to it.
But we have doctors who have said that, and they've been in the room with the nurse too, where they're in with the dying patient, and they will suddenly see a mist leave the person's body. And sometimes it goes, sometimes it stays up and is sucked. One guy described it as like being sucked into a vacuum cleaner tube. It was like this mist of green smoke, and then it was sucked in. And then there's some of the other ones. Well, the light, of course, Raymond covered that. Music is pretty prevalent. People will hear a heavenly music that they can't recreate. Even musically inclined people can't recreate the sound that they heard, which is a frustration to them as well.
Right. And so we don't know what's happening in our brains that is opening up to allow access to this other these other realms in those moments, right? I mean, is that where the research is right now? Is like what's going on maybe?
In some forms of it, like in terminal lucidity, or a person who will be close to dying or may even have actually had a cardiac arrest, and then they come raging back to life. And that can last 2 or 3 or 4 days. In that case, what you have is you actually have some examples in EEGs. Is that right? Yeah, EEGs, ECGs, whatever, where they've seen that the heart will then take off, and also brain waves will start spiking, and that's for a terminal lucidity.
Okay.
But what essentially overall, what this says, what shared death experiences say, is that there's some form of consciousness that leaves the body and goes somewhere else. And it goes to see, loved ones or people that they know, the people they're more connected with. It's
Or that like
so they could do something that's visual that can be witnessed.
right, that shape-shifting kind of Raymond that you talked about, right? That like I've heard, I think I interviewed William Peters, is that
Right.
is that his name?
Yeah.
On the shared death experiences when his book first came out, and he talked about like the sort of geometric shapes that can sometimes happen that people experience. Almost, it sounds like a psychedelic trip of some kind that you're seeing.
That's what I experienced. It like the geometry of the room changed.
Like the sacred geometry type of.
Well, all I know, it was definitely not 3 dimensions. I was in some other kind of, or I don't know whether to call it or spatial or not. Right? It was just something not in the space that I'm in now, for sure.
Yeah.
In the book, you also talk about out-of-body experiences. Right. So can you talk a little bit about those, and how do you feel like these other experiences, shared death experiences, precognitive experiences, terminal lucidity, everything you talk about in the book, lends itself maybe more now or differently now to proof of life after life?
I think, to me, it's proof that there's some kind of a consciousness that's leaving the body that survives bodily death. That's the real question in afterlife studies. Is the body's dead, yet there's evidence with the shared death experience particularly that some form of consciousness has survived. And that's what would have to happen in an afterlife situation.
I kind of have a different take on that because I've never been able to be a physicalist in the sense that it's just inferential that there is an external physical world. I'm sorry, that's the fact. And I realized this when I was 7 or 8 years old, that I can't, when I took my walk this morning, a Diet Coke can was on my desk. And when I came back from my walk, the Diet Coke can was still there. And many people infer from that kind of observation that therefore there is an external physical world. And I'm sorry, that's a false inference. As Bishop George Berkeley pointed out beautifully in the 18th century. And that's the fact. And so proof to me is, there's so many different kinds of proof. When I first started being known for these near-death experiences, I was a professor of philosophy, and one of my favorite things to teach was logic. And so as soon as I got known for this, which was about 1970, I guess, in Greenville, North Carolina, I started hearing people would approach me the same question that I still hear today. And they want to know, Dr. Moody, is there some kind of proof? Can we have proof that there's an afterlife? And in that 1970, my mind would go to Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead and Frege and the people who laid down Wittgenstein, people who laid down the foundation of proof in mathematical and symbolic logic. And that's obviously not, as people would just get blank. But over the years, I've realized, see, in reality, in the real world, proof of life after death is impossible by the Aristotelian logic that we've incorporated even if we never studied it. It's spread out into the practical world and we absorb it. And there are these rules for inference. And those rules of inference are not going to do it for proof of an afterlife.
Right.
They just won't. But there's another aspect to this, which is that we can change that situation by changing our logic. And in the real world, if there is to be proof of an afterlife, there has to be a new code of logic. That's the reality that have been pointed out by David Hume and A.J. Ayer and many great thinkers. But that is what I say, and I'm confident of this, is that in 2025, the barrier to proof of life after death is no longer logical. It is entirely psychological now. And it is people have a hang up, which has been induced in us by Aristotle, essentially, which is preventing us from thinking logically about the afterlife. And, the reality is all of us, I'm sure, understand most, I've just talked about when you tell people these wonderful stories of near-death experiences, they'll sit there for days and listen. But as soon as you talk to them about concepts, their eyes roll up. And that's okay. Not everybody needs to be a symbolic logician, right? But for people who really do want to know and who really are truly curious, not just wanting to know that it is, but rather whether it is. So, in other words, to think of it like, what am I asking here? But if you want to know whether, there is a way toward it. But you have to go through a process of conceptual thinking. And Plato pointed out very beautifully that one of the big difficulties with the question of an afterlife is that people will sit there forever and listen to stories, but concepts they don't much deal with. But he said, even if you had a bazillion stories, it wouldn't add up to proof of an afterlife. He said, what you need in addition is some set of concepts to link the experiential narratives with the statement that there's an afterlife. And that is reality, but.
So are there concepts at this point that link those
two? Yeah. I mean, this is going to sound very abstract, but the hang up that stopped rational inquiry into the afterlife was basically the Christian church. I'm sorry. And basically it's when they were starting their church back in the starting their ideology in the 3rd or 4th century, there wasn't much in the Jewish or Christian scriptures to go on, but they had to say something about the afterlife. So they adopted Plato's Phaedo as the Christian theology of the afterlife. They will deny it and shout at you and say you're in with the devil if you tell them that today, but that is the historical reality. And, they don't want to hear it. But it's, if Plato pointed out, like I said, if you had a bazillion stories, but you need some set of concepts, and he gave up. He just said that's for the future, and then Aristotle kind of complicated things, and it was basically a mistake that Aristotle made in thinking out logic that today prevents us from getting proof of an afterlife. But that's a reality that only a few people can know, because in order to see that, you have to go through conceptual thinking, which is not most people's idea of fun, right? And it's much more fun to listen to stories.
What did you say, Paul?
Just a minute. I think the Christian church is based primarily on the belief in the afterlife. But that is really why people go to church.
I guess that's a big part of it. And like I said, the reality is that that teaching they had, it came from Plato's Phaedo.
Right.
And it was basically Pythagoras, who Well, actually, it was a guy named Pherecydes who was just before Pythagoras, who was apparently the first person to make the claim that the soul is immortal. And one of the very first logical proofs ever constructed was by Alcmaeon, Alcmaeon, who was a rough contemporary of Pythagoras and lived in the same city of Croton. And Alcmaeon created one of the first logical proofs. And his proof was the proof of the immortality of the soul. And it was an argument from analogy. And basically, the development of logic was a long, complex story, but consisting of many elements. But Alcmaeon made one of the first stories that led to the first discoveries that led to the development of the way we think today, was that he said this. Now think of this is say 580 BC, something like that. He made the observation that things that touch on life, things that touch on human life, tend to come in opposite pairs. Up, down, left, right, hot, cold, love, hate, male, female. And he made that observation, and that was a turning point. I know it sounds very primitive, but that was the first insight that led to logic as we have it. And then it's so interesting that one of the first things he wanted to do with his new discovery is to use it to prove the immortality of the soul. And this is how he did it. Okay. To the Greeks, the immortals were the gods. Right. Mm-hmm. And the gods were celestial, like the moon and the sun. They were gods. Okay. And the Greeks knew that the criterion or the essence of a divine being was immortality, right? Okay. So the heavenly bodies are in a circular motion, right? They go from the day they're up in the sky, and then at night they go into the underworld. All right. So he said that immortality, the gods are immortal, and they have a circular motion. And he said, analogously, we human beings, our soul has a circular motion, sleep, wake, right? And so therefore, the soul in its sleep-wake cycle is analogous to the gods who are immortal, so therefore the soul is immortal. And so then Pythagoras also added to the notion of the immortality of the soul. And then in the Phaedo, that's the foundational doctrine of the Christian view. And Plato said that the soul is immaterial and everlasting. And he gave various arguments for that, but then he concluded at the end that he felt it was true, but he said there's not any proof. But he set down the canons by which we still operate. It's like Plato identified all of the factors that still play into the concept of a rational proof of an afterlife.
So is the resistance still around the proof of an afterlife that, where was I going with this? I forget my thinking. I was so captivated by the philosophy class that I'm in right now.
Raymond's the most fascinating story.
Every time I listen to you, I remember this from before, being like, oh my God, if I only would have taken your philosophy class in college.
People in their 50s, I'm just seeing this since I was, very young, people in their 50s, and Plato observed this too. People in their 50s and 60s have been very successful. Around that time, it's just developmental. They start asking themselves about the afterlife. I saw that all the time in psychiatry practice. It's like these people had never thought about it. They were very, earth-based and concerned with their occupation or their profession. But this developmental thing, we're about 50, 60, somewhere in there, especially very successful people will start.
And that's what's happening now, why NDEs and things are peaking in interest. and
Yeah.
why
Yeah,
this
say more.
is such an important book, actually.
It's developmental.
Yeah, say more about why you think there's a peak happening now. I'm curious how much of it you think, like I sort of really saw in the kind of COVID years, I was like, oh boy,
Yeah.
like if we aren't going to face death now and start asking those questions, we're really running from ourselves here.
I think they did. They just couldn't go to bookstores. They were afraid they'd get COVID. So, but book sales
Yeah.
definitely went up. That's for sure. If that's a measure of anything.
Yeah.
The book sales went up
During COVID, oh yeah.
around specifically these
Yeah.
topics.
Oh sure. Yeah.
That was something I had observed many years ago that, because I've been, pretty much on the road lecturing since about 1975 or 6, just lecturing all over. And I have, it's hard to really put your finger on what that propelling force that makes it cyclic is. But it's generational, partly like people grow up. It's developmental that people, but also I observed that during the times where there would be recessions, economic recessions, I would start getting a lot more speaking invitations.
Sure.
And that went on, and I kind of stopped doing that when COVID came on. So I don't know after then, but up to say from 75 to whenever COVID was, all I can say that pretty much that it echoed the economic situation. That when times were tough economically, was good for not just life after death, but the paranormal in general. And I made this observation years ago, and Bruce Grayson, if you know him, Bruce sent me a message. He had been intrigued by that, and so he started looking for journal articles on that, and he found one. I forgot what it was because several moved since then, but Bruce said that these two investigators, sociologists or whatever they were, had determined that the paranormal was cyclic, and it was the reverse of the economic cycle. So when times
So
are
something
good,
about
there's
had a
less.
doomsday feel to them.
Yeah, or maybe something about the search for, like, is there something more? Like more looking for more meaning, more sort of transpersonal, transcendent experiences that help us make sense of why we're here. I don't know.
Yeah, it's.
Those are still
I'm just astonished.
Questions, right?
Yeah. I'm kind of astonished, as you two must be, also, that so few people are take the question of an afterlife seriously. It's they may act like they do, but when the get right down to it, they don't want to think very clearly about it. It's John Alexander, who was a guy was an IANS who helps get it going and all. Was the last time I had spent a lot of time with John years ago, and I would tell him about my theories about the paranormal and its relationship to recreation and entertainment. And, he would just sit there. This was 20-something years ago, and John would just sit there with this blank look on his face. But about 2 years ago, he called me, and he said, Ray, he had been recently to the IANS meeting, and he said, Ray, he said, those people want to be entertained.
Sure.
And I said, like, duh, but it's true. It's like there's a kind of recreational aspect that comes with interest in this whole thing, which is not bad. See, it's only in America because of the Puritans that this is objected to. I've talked about this in Europe for decades. And over there, people say, that I could give them my argument to show the relationship between recreation and entertainment and the paranormal. And I say the argument is I do the same arguments in the United States. Oh, no. And the reason is that there's the Puritans, right? If you're having fun, there's something evil about it, right? So you can't really in America be regarded as recreation can't be regarded as an inherently good thing because it's evil in the Puritan mind. But if you
So
look at the
go.
if
Oh,
you look at the definition of recreation, the etymology of it, it's different from recreation, which is recreating something. Recreation, the word, originally meant, hold on to your hats, spiritual consolation.
mm.
And so to me, it's pretty obvious that people seek things about the paranormal and the near-death experiences for spiritual consolation. And what's wrong with that?
What do you think is still the pushback around this proof? I mean, you have given so many anecdotal stories and across cultures, across ages, across genders, and people continue, whether it's a near-death experience, a shared death experience, an out-of-body experience. My spiritually transformative experience was multiple visits from loved ones who had passed.
I think has a lot to do with what Raymond talked about earlier, was concepts. We're born with certain concepts. We're born essentially with certain types of belief, and they get hammered into us. And it's hard to back away from those concepts.
Yeah.
It's hard to step back and it's hard to say, I don't know. That's one thing. And then accept that as a viable concept. But it is, I mean, I love Raymond because over the years, Raymond is not afraid to say, I don't know.
I know when I asked earlier about, what is it that causes some people to have these? He said, I don't know.
That's great. And then there's another factor as well, is that there's been a big turn against organized religion in the last few years. I think the polls show that about the question. And because people lump afterlife into religion, they have a tendency to reject it. But if you really think about it, the afterlife has nothing to do with religion. Really, it's been co-opted by religion.
Well, I think there's been a turn away from religion, although maybe that's shifting back a little bit. Yeah. But I do think there's been a turn towards spirituality.
Yeah, definitely.
Separate from religion.
And there's also, in terms of the organized opposition, Amy, to this, it's two factions mainly. One is humanism. And humanism, unfortunately, has misappropriated the wonderful word skeptic. And the humanists characterized themselves as skeptical inquirers, which proves decisively, number one, that they are ignoramuses, which is not to me a value concept. It's just like an ignoramus is a person who consciously ignores something. Okay? But which we all do in some way. But humanism it consists mostly of people who were tormented by religion or turned off by religion when they were a kid. So they gave that up and they said there's no God and such. But then what happened was that they found out that they really enjoyed the social part. They were against the doctrine. So they formed these humanist societies to be against God in an organized way, essentially. And they call themselves skeptics, but they are not skeptics. The skeptical movement was founded by Pyrrho, Pyrrho, who was an early Greek philosopher after Aristotle. And the essence of the skeptical method is to ask every question and really bear down, but in the end, refrain from drawing a conclusion. That's what it means. And it was a spiritual practice for mind expansion and also to improve your cognition. But so when somebody says, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences, I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. You unpack that, and what they're saying is, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is that, is brain damage or whatever. And that just shows the most striking arrogance to me. I mean, what's wrong with saying, I don't know? But anyway, so the skeptical movement is one of the big resistors, and the other are the fundamentalist Christians who think this is all of the devil, right? And those are the two main factors that hold back this. And it's the so-called scientific skeptics have nothing to do with science. A lot of them are entertainers, entertainers claiming to be scientific skeptics, and they don't know what the word skeptic means. To me, that's just hilarious.
But from where we sit in this moment right now, you believe that when we die, our soul goes on. Is that how you would define life after life?
What I would say is not
a consciousness.
But what I'd say is I gather that. I just can't figure my way out of it. Right? My method is always to try to raise objections, because if you take some view and you try to knock it down, then as hard as you can, then what you have left over is you have some confidence in. The way these other people operate is they figure out what they think they want to know, and then they build some flimsy bridge of so-called reasons to support it. And that's why they are always so miserable. Right? Because, you know when you're deceiving yourself.
Paul, where do you fall now with all of this?
Well, initially, I didn't. I hate to say I define myself as a skeptic because I wrongfully did that. But I didn't. I thought near-death experiences were some kind of a dream or some result of brain damage. And then you start to hear dozens of them, and then hundreds of them, and they have elements that are common, and they have effects that are common. And then you start to see them as different, as being they cleared one barrier, they cleared another barrier. And then when we got into studying shared death experiences, to me, that cleared the barrier of just proving that something survives bodily death. And that's how I feel about shared death experiences, that it's proof of something surviving bodily death. What that is, I don't know. But it's something that is magical and something that connects with other people as the person passes away. So to me, that is the terminology of afterlife, is the survival of consciousness.
I've arrived at that same thing by a different method, which is just I give up.
Yeah,
I can't think my way out of it. I really can't.
Well,
so,
because it's when you give up that enlightenment comes.
Yeah.
Right. You surrender. I would say I surrender to
the universe.
I give.
Right. I'll never forget.
I gather.
Yeah, I like that. I took my husband years ago when I first started having these experiences to see a medium.
Yeah.
And because I wanted him to witness this experience. And I said, so what do you think? And he goes, I can't really say it is true, and I can't say it's not, because I saw it with my own eyes. And so I can't dispute what I experienced as real. And I think that there's something to that. It's once you've had these experiences and you know them in your soul to be reality, how do you disprove that reality?
Yeah. Right.
I give up on the mediums too. There's some things I know about mediums, which one thing I know is that some of them are sincere. My oldest friend from 1976 is a medium, and I knew her family. Her sister told me that when my friend was 5 years old, they took her to a rabbi because she could talk to dead people. And the rabbi interviewed her, and he told her parents she has a gift. And she was sincere. I also know that some of them are fraudulent.
Right. Like anything, right?
Yeah.
There are good people who are doing good things in any fields and people who are not so good at anything.
One thing I know about mediums that nobody else does, because I was a philosopher of language, And that is that a lot of the effects of mediumship come from figures of speech. And there are three figures of speech in specific. One is the figure of speech of prosopopoia, which is the figure of speech in which you talk about a dead person in the present tense. And as Aristotle observed, that talking about dead people in the present tense, prosopopoia, creates a almost hallucinatory sense of presence. And a good example of that, if you've ever been to Charlottesville, Amy, but anyway, Charlottesville, Virginia, is the town where Thomas Jefferson was born. And in Charlottesville, you don't say Thomas Jefferson, you say Mr. Jefferson. And at the University of Virginia, if you are a PhD, you're not called doctor, because Mr. Jefferson didn't have a PhD. If you're an MD, it's okay, but, and so back in about 2019, maybe 2000, there was an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine. They had sent a young journalist down to Charlottesville to check the place out. And within a couple of paragraphs of the beginning, he said, Thomas Jefferson still walks the streets of Charlottesville. Now, if you're like me, the hair grows up on your arm. Mm-hmm. And that is prosopopoia. Another one is idolopopoia, which is quoting a dead person. And that too, it's like putting something in the words of a dead person. And you see this on tombstones sometimes is a place where you see this. And it's like you give in the 50s, there was a big fad on this. And people were asking celebrities to write their own tombstones.
Yeah.
And one of them I remember was Ernest Hemingway, who said, I can't stand up. And then another one was, let's see, Groucho Marx, who said, I forgot. But, the point is that when you put something that on a tombstone, it gives you the feeling of hearing from that person directly. I mean, you just check it out by looking at some examples. And so mediums do that. They do both. They use prosopopoia and idolopopoia, see, which is they talk about a dead person in the present tense, or they quote a dead person's words. And that, even outside the medium's consultation room, creates a sense of vividity. And another one is apostrophe, where apostrophe is a figurative form of address where you address an absent or deceased or imaginary person. And it's often in poetry, break, break, break on thy cold gray stones, O sea, right? And that creates these effects. And if you try to analyze the communications of a medium, you see this. I mean, they use those figures of speech, right? But parapsychologists are not conceptual thinkers. They're just not. They're in a hurry to get to the laboratory. And none of the stuff I've ever seen on mediumship talks about these obvious facts, right? And so I say that all of the parapsychological work on mediumship is faulted. I think it's nonsensical is what I think, because they don't think concepts. They want to hear these stories and to feel those sensations. So they don't stand outside of themselves and say that look at the obvious things that appear to a philosopher of language about these linguistic changes. And another one, and this is, I had to learn all about interrogation because my life depended. I mean, I worked in a maximum security unit for the criminally insane. And you have to learn how to ask people questions because somebody, including you, might get killed if you make a mistake, right? And so mediums have question and answer sessions with their clients, right?
Right.
But no parapsychologist ever investigate this. They don't know the different forms of interrogation. And there's apoplegia. I mean, I could list half dozen here. But if you're a parapsychologist, you want something else than the truth. But if you want the truth, you have to look at these linguistic things that are so important in mediums. I've never been, historically, what I call the afterlife establishment is parapsychology and psychical research and the pseudo-skeptics, right? And the demonologists. There's kind of three factions in the afterlife establishment. And a great philosopher of the 20th century, J.L. Austin, observed that if you see a controversy that just goes on and on and on and on, endlessly with no progress, he said, you begin to suspect that it's not in what the difficulty is not in what the people appear to disagree on, but rather it's the problem is in what they agree on. But because they all agree on it, they don't bring it up for examination. And all three of these major factions, the demonologists, the parapsychologists, and the pseudo-skeptics, have the same working assumption, which is that what they are dealing with is literal, meaningful language, and that is simply not true. When you say there is a life after death, what you are saying is there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life, which is a self-contradiction. And all of the common words and expressions for life after death are figures of speech, every one of them. And it's never literalized. So you see, what keeps this whole thing going is that the three contending parties actually have the same false assumptions that keep it from going anywhere. And it's partly not necessarily that would consciously appreciate this, but it's basically the structure. That structure of debate is designed to keep the debate going for the entertainment purposes. See, it's not that they're looking for truth. Because if they were looking for truth, they would know all this stuff about prosopopoia and idolopopoia and apostrophe, but they don't. And that to me is a sign that they're actively ignoring the main sticking point that keeps their research in the crime. It's so interesting that parapsychology is a failed profession, right? And that's why it made such a great comic impact in these, what was the Ghostbusters, right?
Oh, right.
And it's like the neat thing about the comic premise in those movies is that in reality, parapsychology is a failed profession. There's never done anything, right, except just repeat this endlessly meaningless stuff.
Well,
but
Raymond,
because of that, that's why the parapsychologists are so funny on the screen, because it's the actual opposite of what they do in real life. See, they have these spectacular public successes, which is the comic contrast, which makes the parapsychologists on the screen funny, because they're so different from the ones in reality. And by the way, this is nothing personal. These are dear friends of mine, and they know I talk like this, and they don't seem to mind.
Well, Raymond and Paul, thank you so much for your time today, but not just today for your time with me today, but for your life's work of proving life after life. It has been an honor to be in conversation with both of you. It has been a joy to read your work over time and just see how it has literally changed the zeitgeist of this conversation. And, I think changes mental health and changes, everything that if people are willing to engage with it, it will change how they think about their life.
Thank you very much.
I want to say, though, that I got this from Plato, right? And people should read Plato. I got it from Plato and from George Ritchie. So I'm glad that it had all those good effects, but it came not from me, but from Plato and
channeled
George.
work. It's Raymond's channeled work, Dr. Moody's channeled work. Well, thank you both so much. If people are interested, Paul, where can they find the book and everything about your work?
They can find the book at Amazon for sure. They can also go on, Raymond's website, lifeafterlife.com.
Lifeafterlife.com.
Yeah. And my website for books is glimpsesofeternity.com.
Well, thank you both so much for your time
Thanks
today.
a lot, Amy.
Thank you, guys. This was great fun. Paul and Amy, thank you all so much.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.